Good morning, everyone. Great to be with each other in the working chapel here at the seminary and on Zoom. We are delighted to see you and gather here for this, our second day of spring convocation 2022. I'm Deb Krause, president of the seminary, and I'm delighted to welcome you here and to continue this celebration of how the work of decolonizing and pluralist religious conversation and friendship are creating ways forward for the church and for movements for human freedom. We convened an hour ago for a worship service with the Black Alumni Association. It was on Zoom, and in that worship service, we heard a powerful prophetic word from Reverend Dr. Anthony Scott, an Ethan alum, and Dr. Scott, affectionately known as the Bishop, among his classmates and the community, addressed, I think, a theme that really starts us well, which is the capacity to do great violence in the attempt to create unity, that can become a form of violence and conformity and coercion. And it's a story and the legacies of which are well known and powerfully experienced throughout the world and a part of the legacy of the church. And this conversation, done last night with Dr. Shalom Glaucus, Dr. Scott, and Dr. Niles, reflecting on the ministry and scholarship of Alan Miller and Dottie Miller and the ways in which they led this seminary in the middle and latter part of the 20th century to resist these coercive, tyrannical, colonialist projects of the church, how that is enduring at Eden and in many other places, and yet the work is far from over. You may recall, if you were here, how Dr. Niles invited us to think about the theological school of the 22nd century. And that may seem like a sort of whimsical thing to do, but of course, in any kind of imagination like that, we are really rhetorically aspiring to do the work now. And so it's a very powerful challenge, and I believe this conversation today that Dr. Niles has curated for us as the Alan and Dottie Miller Chair for Mission and Peace here at the seminary and our professor of constructive theology, with her colleagues from around the country and around the world, that we will be invited into a conversation that begins to open up these legacies and opportunities in powerful and important ways for this school, for the church. So thank you for being here. As Professor Grundy noted, after our session today, we will have worship. And following that, we will gather for our Herbster alumni event, which we're excited to participate in as well. So let's go.
Excuse me. That's fantastic. So I'm going to visit my friends, so I need to see them when I talk to them. Don't need to have my back to you. But I do want to invite everyone in this room and in the Zoom room to enter into the conversation that we will start. I'm going to do very short introductions because I'd rather them be able to talk about themselves much more. I am thrilled to have these four people in the room with you today. Yes, they are renowned scholars, they do great things, but I welcome them all as friends, and they're my conversation. These are my colleagues, and I'm very proud they let me to be part of their group. The first one I want to talk about is Christine Hong, who is the Associate Professor of Educational Ministry, Practical Theologian at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. In her former life, she was the staff person to the Interfaith Committee of the Presbyterian Church USA. The second is Dr. Judith Berlin. She's Professor Emeriti of Chinese and Japanese religion and comparative religions, and former dean at the Graduate Theological in Berkeley. Dr. Amos Young is the dean of the School of Mission and Theology and professor of theology and mission at Fuller Theological Seminary. Eliezer Fernandez is professor of constructive theology at United Theological Seminary and the president of the Union Theological Seminary in the Philippines. I'm not sure which country he's talking to us from today. I think it's Manila. And this is a professor, Dr. Krause, we have no ideas, who works full-time in the US and the Philippines at the same time. So these are my friends, these are my colleagues, and I'm so grateful to all four of them for being here with you and me today. I'm just going to open it up as we thought we would. Oh, the other thing I want to say very quickly is we will break around, I think about 9:45, so that we can go into small groups. If you lift your hand, Brett Palmer, Marion Edmonds, and Benjamin Heaney will lead small groups so you can have conversations together. And I want you to think about, as we speak, how this could impact the way you think of the ministries that you do where you are. But to start with, friends, so that I can see you commit. They'll figure it out. The question I want to start with, the question I want us to work with first is the conversation around the theme that the seminary has given us, which was pluralism, a vision for decolonizing Christianity. What the four of you think of this idea and how you would start to reframe it yourselves.
Damayanti, could you please repeat the question? I couldn't hear it.
Okay. Sorry, technology is not our friend today. The first question I'd like to talk about is the title form that we're using for Spring Convocation itself, which is Pluralism, a Vision for Decolonizing Christianity. As the four of you know, I feel that the languages of inclusivism and exclusivism are both still colonial enterprises. It is only when we go for an option of multiplicity helpful spaces in which more voices can be heard. But I'm just going to open us up with that question. And I'd love to hear any of the responses. And if you would respond to each other, even better.
Sorry, Dr. Carlos.
I'll weigh in. Some years ago, I attended a conference in California on the future of Christianity in China. And half of the people there were people who were China specialists who had lived in Chinese culture, were from Chinese culture, understood Chinese culture. And half of them were more traditional Euro-American theological types. And what we discovered is a big divide in the people, but between people who could grasp that Christianity in China in the future wasn't going to look like the Christianity that those of us in North America knew, because it was going to be culturally shaped by Chinese patterns. It isn't that the beliefs were different so much as that the practices and the way of embodying those beliefs would be radically different. And the people who didn't have enough experience of Chinese culture couldn't grasp that there could be a completely different lens for looking at and embodying Christianity. And it taught me again that those of us who are from North America and Europe, tend to just unconsciously assume that our cultural lens is somehow essential to Christianity. And we can't really decolonize Christianity until we can pull back that cultural lens.
I agree with Judith, and I wanted to add another layer of thinking around this word decolonization. I feel like in many theological circles that this word decolonize has actually been very much colonized, that it's been defined and redefined apart and away from people that it matters to very concretely. And here in the United States, that would be Indigenous people. And so what do we mean when we say decolonize? Who are we actually talking about? Which histories and which people? And when we start getting into that conversation, I think that the impetus for a lot of people is to try to figure out who to center and who to talk about. But that's precisely kind of the antithesis of what we're talking about in terms of pluralism. This desire that we have innately, sometimes as Christians, to want to find a center and a margin, because that's how we negotiate relationships across religion and culture, doesn't necessarily work when we're talking about real uncolonizing, right? So doing away with this idea of subject and or other and center. So I think there's more for us to think about, even just around that word of decolonial. What do we mean and who are we actually talking about, and what's our responsibility and accountability in that framework?
Let me follow on Christine's point, and also Judith, problematizing our theme or topic for today is very important. I don't necessarily expect that we arrive at a solution to this challenge, but at least we can problematize our theme. And talking about decentering, I would also like to underscore the word what we normally use as anti-Western, anti-imperial, anti-racist. All those anti-imperial still revolves around the empire. Even as we try to distance ourselves, our reference point is still the imperial Christianity. And so it's very easy for this imperial Christianity to allow us to have our space, even in liberal Protestants or Roman Catholic seminaries. And we are so happy that now I can teach liberation theology, others can teach feminist theology, but the discourse still controlled by the, whatever you call this imperial hierarchical center that continues to be inclusive, yet at the same time suffocating.
That's what I always say. I feel like our inclusivism is imperial and colonizing. Inclusive theology, the progressive movement, is a colonizing enterprise. And I know I'm going to get in trouble for this, but I'm with friends. I think liberation theology is part of the trauma of oppression, because we haven't learned alternative ways. We just go, well, the person who was oppressed gets to be the oppressor now. We haven't really we're staying in the circles of trauma and oppression that we continue. And I find that new visions, multiple new visions, are still not part of that conversation yet. And I find that frustrating at best. And it makes the work hard to do anywhere. I mean, I know we're doing it for at least all of us, aside from Eleazar, who's teaching in the Philippines and building buildings. All of us are working in a lot of majority Christian spaces, doing liberation theology so we can continue our majority Christian spaces, which makes it very interesting to me and very frustrating for me. Amos?
Yeah, I really, hopefully everybody can hear me. I really appreciate that remark. I think it names a lot of tensions that theological discourse needs to grapple with. The tensions that, not just theological discourse, but discourse around the evangel, let's say, the good news, right? It's how do we talk about the good news, or as Judith mentioned, how do we live out and embody the good news? And of course, if we want to further complicate things, how do we feel? I mean, there's a orthodoxy dimension of beliefs, there's the praxis dimension, but then there's a pathic dimension of religiosity and human religiosity, right? And so how do feelings factor in relative to, let's say, the imperializing or colonizing dimensions of discourse, particularly discourse that one might feel emerges from out of one's life circumstances in all of its complicatedness. Each one of our lives map onto, intersect with, come out of, shaped by, informed by, etc. You know, layers of imperial and neo-imperial and under-imperial and etc. forces, so that our witnesses are complicated by all of that, where it's difficult for us to discern exactly. And it's that witness which emerges also out of the feelings that have been shaped by life trajectories of both trauma and of, if you will, achievement and accomplishment within all of the complexities of what our lives and our journeys all entail. And so the question in part would be, you know, how does one bear witness at this discursive level? That's the discourse level. Words can be totalizing. And of course, part of the task, part of the invitation is how do we be attentive to the ways in which our discourse either persists and extends, if you will, totalizing sort of sentiments or sensibilities or even affectivities, right? How our feelings get communicated in our discourse and in our practices. I suppose that one way in which I've been grappling with a lot of these tensions in my own life, and I'll sort of shift theologically for a moment, in part because I do think that as theologians, we're always between and betwixt, sort of deconstructing and constructing. So naming the challenges, naming the problematics on the one hand, but yet if we're going to be witnesses to the evangel, we've got to find some way to construct, right? So that construction then comes back, and then we have to deconstruct what we just said, and then we keep. But I think one of the ways in which I've been in my own journey, as particularly coming from my own Pentecostal tradition, is to go back, for instance, to the Pentecost narrative and finding ways in which Scripture can itself illuminate this betwixt and between, this multiplicity, this layeredness. So when we talk about pluralism as a contemporary vision, and again, being very concerned about being anachronistic, about simply imposing any contemporary understanding of pluralism upon, let's say, the New Testament or that, right? But again, reading between the two horizons and being attentive to ways in which we both impose as well as hopefully are shaped by. I keep finding myself being intrigued by how the Pentecost narrative itself evinces all of these fissures, all of these tensions. And so you've got these 16 nations that are referenced in Acts 2. And one way in which I read this in terms of our theme of pluralism is you've got these various marginalities positions, sort of betwixt and between two kinds of totalizing discourses. You've got the Roman political totalizing discourse, and then you've got the apostolic discourse, which is which is to the ends of the earth. There's also a grand vision, right, for what this theological discourse accomplishes. How does the apostolic discourse and the Roman discourse sort of, how do they, on the one hand, both mutually inform and sort of inspire each other, maybe even unintentionally, but then how do they also sort of challenge each other? And particularly, how does apostolic discourse challenge Roman discourse? And then how do we find, if you will, between those two discourses, the discourses of the Phoenicians and the Galatians, and again, these other groups that are named in Acts 2 that are all bearing witness out of their own languages, right? And so that encourages me to sort of find my story in part in betwixt and between this whirlwind of, if you will, first century Mediterranean imperial and apostolic and forces and struggles, right? And naming then my own sort of identity as in part apostolic, in part Roman, in part Asian. And of course, there's an Asian that's unique to first century Mediterranean sensibilities that's not my Asian today, but nevertheless, I mean, the character of that situatedness means that these identities are already plural. As an Asian believer in the New Testament, that's betwixt and between Jerusalem and Athens. Jerusalem, Athens, and maybe even Rome, right? But the Asian believer, me, is already complicated by the fact that I'm situated betwixt and between these various totalizing discourses, and in part struggling to find my own witness. And Acts 2 says that they found their witness in their own languages.
Right.
That witness then invites sort of a conversation, because the apostolic conversation was, now, what does that mean again? And then the conversation unfolds, right? And then I think the invitation in the conversation is to deconstruct. But the deconstruction is, of course, not for its own sake, but for the sake of, at least as I read Acts 2, for declaring the wondrous works of God. And then you deconstruct what you just declared, and then you continue the conversation. So those are some ways theologically that I've been able to find pluralism, not as the other that needs to
be included,
but as already internal to myself.
Correct.
And internal to the community, actually, that I'm a part of, this Pentecostal community, that may not recognize its pluralism, right? But the New Testament might give us some resources to articulate that pluralism of cultures, that pluralism, that the political pluralisms, the ideological ones, the economic ones that are all there in the text. And then how do we teach ourselves to read, again, careful, not just read ourselves back into scripture, right? But finding ways in which scripture also helps us to name the kinds of things that we might not have been able to name before.
That pushes us, I think, very appropriately into another venue I'd like to hear from you and to talk about is, how does your Asian, I'm going to say interfaith, but how all of you, including Judith, how your Asian selves have shaped the way you have been and are becoming Christian? Because that is a gift that we have been needing and requiring to do to be our whole selves. So I just throw that into the room.
I would like to begin on that because I was very inspired by what Amos just said. And he brilliantly showed himself finding his complex identities within the biblical tradition. And as Christians, we do that. But I want to say I was raised Reformed in Dubuque, Iowa, which when I was growing up was still fighting the wars of the Reformation. I mean, Catholic and Protestants were literally fighting on the streets. Sometimes there were gangs and people knew what properties were Catholic and what were Protestant, and religious friction was just very, very big. And I grew up across from the Presbyterian Church and Seminary. So I was very much in the middle of all that fight. If you were Protestant in Dubuque, you knew why, because it was like 80% Catholic. And so one of the issues that have been haunting me is religious tension, religious exclusivism. And I think one of the reasons I was first drawn to Asian religions was because, especially East Asian religions, are fundamentally much more inclusive. People weren't just Confucian or Buddhist or Taoist, they were kind of all of the above. And I wanted to understand that. And so I was drawn to it for that. But what I learned was a deeper lesson, which helped me, and this is the tie to Amos, to help me go back and reread my Christian tradition in a more nuanced way. And that is one of the profound ways that inclusivity worked in China. There was plenty of competition, but still at some very deep level, it was more inclusive, is that in all of those traditions, they were very clear that the sacred could not be captured by any human doctrine. That the sacred was the sacred, but it was always beyond what your mind understood, always beyond. And that for the sake of human living, we had to have many gods, we had to pray, and we had to do all of this stuff. But that wasn't the ultimate per se. The ultimate per se was beyond human understanding. Now we say that in Christian theology, God is beyond human understanding, but we sort of say it, or at least the way I was taught it, we say it and gloss over it and go on to the next thing. And what I learned from Asian religions was to hold the views that I'd inherited a little more lightly so that I could listen for the complexities underneath. I could listen for the ways they were unfolding. I could listen for the kind of various views within Christianity that opened it up in a way for me and for my understanding of other people who claimed that identity. And that has been extremely central to me.
Yesterday, one of the scholars who was speaking and to answer to in response to some other things she had heard was talking about the difference between right and righteousness, because one is relational and one is correct. And we get caught up in getting it right. And also, we're going to talk so I can tell you what to do correct, right, it's right. And we get caught up and in that conversation. And if I'm right and not in relationship, is it actually right anymore? And for me, the whole gift of growing up in a much more multicultural, multi-religious way is I may be right, but I have no relationships. And if I don't, the communities from which I come go to fighting, as Judith says, and go to killing each other and dying. And that's unhelpful at its root. So it's like, well, Christianity says, and we have this, doesn't help do anything but destroy community. So then what is its value anymore? That was an early learning for me. I learned to hold it lightly as a result. And so that makes a difference. Especially in this time when the inclusive movement wants to get it right. They tell us which pronouns to use, which language to use, which testament to read, how to read it correctly. And you're going, I feel a little nervous about this because it feels too confident when talking about God. My 2 cents worth.
I love this part of the conversation, and I really appreciate also going back to Amos's story, how he really laid out how his identity is shaped. And it was making me think, like Judith, about how the more I actually let go of Christianity and lean into the recovery of Korean indigenous traditions and spiritualities, for instance, actually the more Christian I become. right? The more actually I experience God as incredibly more expansive than I actually experienced God growing up in the Presbyterian Church. And I feel so much more drawn in by the divine presence and connected to the divine presence every waking hour. And it becomes, but it's difficult because it's a contradiction. And so, you know, I feel like this question of how do we as Christians understand that sometimes our desire towards the perfect Christian narrative, or the narrative of getting it right as Christians, or what the right type of Christianity is actually a supremacist ideology. That's actually something that doesn't belong in the Christian tradition. And that the Christian tradition is about honoring a God that is expansive beyond what we actually can ever know as finite beings. And when we can let go of pursuing the perfect iteration of Christianity, which is actually a white supremacist Christianity, we can actually encounter God in ways that are not filtered through that ideological lens of what Eliezer was talking about in terms of that white gaze always being present. So for me, it's been really, you know, my personal journey in the reclaiming of a lot of the indigenous practices of Korean spirituality has made me feel so much more anchored in my own Christian spirituality and practices, yet it horrifies people in my family. So there's that contradiction, right? Is that the more you actually feel sometimes drawn into the divine by expanding your spirituality to be more inclusive, your community might actually push you away. So it's not a full embrace, right? There is embrace, and then there is pushback. But again, that contradictory space and that space of conflict, like Amos is talking about, produces things. It's not always something we should run away from. It actually sharpens the way that our faith is embodied.
If I may follow, when Amos mentioned about, I think of pluralism is already inside us. Something for me that I have to reclaim. And because of this colonial enterprise, I think it has been muted or subdued for so long. But when I relate it to theology, I often think about the Trinity as even the plurality within the divine life. So at the heart of reality is actually plurality, but because of power dynamics, this plurality has been homogenized, and I'm trying to reclaim it even in my own life. For me, I cannot separate religious identity and my own racial ethnic iteration. In fact, I can use the same concepts when I speak about my identity as Filipino and Filipino American, and also my understanding of Christianity, and multiple belongings and multiple identities. I understand what it means to be marginalized not only once, but many times, even in the Philippines. People assume that I speak Tagalog as a national language. No, I don't. I can't. I would rather speak English. I'm more fluent, at least in English, than in the national language of the Philippines, because there are so many languages, and there are also dynamics of interaction within the country itself, the dominant and the periphery, we call it. But I've learned so many layers of marginalization, even in the language categories in the Philippines. When I was in the Philippines, of course, I am now in the Philippines, I was simply a Filipino. That's why I always have a hard time trying to distance and then to embrace myself wherever I am. When I was in the Philippines, I was simply a Filipino. But when I arrived in the US, I became a person of color, a racial ethnic minority, and that's a very painful one that I have experienced. And I think that's also true with my experience of my own religious life. Being a member of Protestant denomination in a predominantly Roman Catholic Christianity. It's also part of that. And I must say that Christianity actually behave in certain ways, different ways, depending on the power dynamics. Okay? If your Christianity is the dominant one in your country, it behaves differently. The Roman Catholic Christianity in the Philippines behaves differently when it is in the US, when it is part of the many. Just to give you an example, we don't have ATS or something like that equivalent in the Philippines. Because if you are the dominant one, why do you have to deal with the minorities? Whereas if you are one among many, you have the more inclined to be part of a larger group, including groups that are predominantly Protestant. But that's not happening in the Philippines. So even within Christianity, the behavior of Christianity is always affected in relation to your position in terms of power dynamics. That's very critical. So for me, the question of pluralism must be tied to the issue of how we question power dynamics, center of power dynamics, and how we disperse that. It cannot be separated from the issue of economics and politics.
I agree. My heart was hurt because I agree with you that I went from being Sri Lankan to being a person of color, and not a correct person of color living in the Midwest, because everybody knows here has a dominant understanding of what a person of color is, and I'm not one of that. So even when we become multiple, when we become two, and they are in conversation with each other and trying to find my space racially, let alone religiously, in a dominantly Christian world is not a simple one. And Eliezer and, well, all four of you in different ways have talked about, it's more than decentering. It is taking everybody to a space where you can see each other. So in this room, I have my back to a bunch of people so I can talk to you. And I'm aware of how intense that is actually. Because my conversation partners I can't see, which I turn to so I could talk to you. But there is a thing, it's so important to see the multiplicity around us to make it work. What I noticed when I was doing my own theological work is I truly believe humanity is plural. I believe creation is plural. And if we are made in the image of God, then God must be infinitely plural, that more than that Judith alluded to and Amos alluded to in different ways. We are a plurality who are a finite version of the divine plurality around us, but we're still trying to make it one, or if not one and the other. Yeah. And for those of us plural beings that have to be part of the other, which is always one other, it's an interesting space to find voice and find reality. Because you're always talking over and against whatever's in charge. And in Amos, you made this point most poignantly, and I want to re-emphasize it, is that it's not just outside ourselves, it's within ourselves. Yeah. And that's within myself, I am plural. And I can't choose the boxes appropriately of where I fit. It's like I'm always those things all the time. And you know, all of us have taught in religious institutions where we're supposed to help define and form people. I'm like, I have no idea. I can barely form myself on a good day. Like, go have fun. I think that's important.
We laugh about it, but I think there's a lot of truth there. I'm a little bit jealous, Christine, of your being able to articulate how you found some grounding in retrieval of some of the indigenous traditions and practices. There's a part of me actually that's still on that journey of what does it mean for me to be regrounded in that sort of way. I mean, some of you may know, others may not. I'm Chinese, come from a Chinese background. My parents are Chinese, but I was born in Malaysia to Pentecostal preachers. And so I never had any exposure in my upbringing to, as Pentecostal converts and then ministers. Looking east, so to speak, was never part of the practice. But yet there was filial piety that was practiced without no discursive capacity to articulate what that was. There was a way of moderation that was practiced with very little clue that was also grounded in East Asian sensibilities and piety, actually. So I grew up with those kinds of practices, but they were given Christian discursive nomenclature and Christian discursive categories. I only began to understand that Christian discursive way of thinking and even talking about who I was shared by other people that were non-Christians, right? And actually was embedded within my family, even though we had never been given the capacity to articulate it as kids. I have 2 younger brothers. So there's a sense in which my own journey, if you will, east, I look like I should know, but I'm actually on a journey, right? To discover not just myself, but who we are as a human race, so to speak, that's constituted by this worldwide nature and character. And so, Eliezer, when you say that there's these many marginalizations that you've experienced, I keep wondering, am I Chinese, or am I Chinese Malaysian, or am I Chinese Malaysian American, or am I Asian American, or am I what exactly? Those are the kinds of questions I was asking my parents when I was a teenager, beyond all the other confusing things that teenagers go through. And at that point, the answer was I was a Christian, right? So I do wonder in many respects, what does it mean for this Christian grounding that has been a part of my life? And so there's this interesting element to, I think, what you mentioned also, Amanyati, is that the relationship is what counts. And when, for us as Pentecostal evangelicals growing up, we never thought about Christianity as a religion. We always said it was a relationship with Jesus.
Mhm.
And that kind of piety, I think, does allow some, and maybe an increasing number of Pentecostals, charismatics, evangelicals, if they really press into that relational dimension, they begin to see that Jesus is accessible beyond the institutional boundaries. And actually, if we actually go beyond that to understand that no other religion ever claims it's a religion. If we ever attend to the way in which that discourse emerged, that was a category and a thing we created as moderns to try to categorize certain forms, practices, feelings, sensibilities, etc. I mean, we all know the story as academics, right? But nobody ever says I'm part of a religion. They're part of, like you said, a community of practice, or a community of whatever, a complex community, and very dynamic communities. All of us are, right? So then it would be then a matter of then finding those relational connections, whether even if one is centered in Jesus, if we're not worried about setting that relationship off over and against other relationships, but to the degree that a Jesus centeredness by the Holy Spirit can invite us to communal relationships, interpersonal relationships. Evangelicals, I think, are very committed to that interpersonal relationship, which I think those are one of the openings that would potentially help us to recognize how we can, even if we want to begin at this interpersonal level, right, find that relational connection, that capacity to see the image of God in Jesus, even in others, that then in that relational interaction shines a further light as in a mirror on me, and then go from there to finding then those other points of contact that then make our journeys, hopefully over time, richer. So I'm still wrestling, what does it mean for me to be Chinese, Malaysian, American, or what have you. Recently, myself and a number of Malaysian born-based and diasporic colleagues put together a little book. We titled it From Kuala Lumpur to the Ends of the Earth, about Malaysian and Malaysian diaspora reflection. Like, how do we situate ourselves in this space that's indigenous to the Southeast Asian peninsula on the one hand, but yet, again, as that space post-neo, late colonial and global and all of that, right? And many of us spread out in different parts across Asia, across Oceania, across North America, and even Europe. Then thinking about what does it mean to bear, if you will, witness in our tongues in this journey. Trying to find that both indigenous and yet theological, and I would put it evangel-centric witness.
Right.
Evangelical and evangel-centric, I think we can also parse out some of those complexities related to those. So yeah, hopefully at some point I'll be a bit more anchored, but still on the way at this point.
And when you figure it out, will you let me know, Amos?
I'll write another book maybe.
Yes, and I'll assign it to my students. For me, when you said it's a relationship with Jesus, it's like, I can't understand my relation, and this is where I echo a bit of Christine. I figured out how to relate to Jesus. It's a wonderful theological idea and emotional idea, but because I have relationships elsewhere that are very much like, oh, that's how you, the reason I can have filial piety to those around me, and as you know, as Asians, the piety, the relationship to the elder sense is because I related to my grandparents. I relate to my parents. So I know how to do that elsewhere. And I understand piety in relationship to Jesus because I have other relationships. I'm like, oh, that's how you do it. Because the transliteration of that idea to me as a Sri Lankan is a lovely transliterated idea. But when you actually figure out what it might mean to you, and I, like Eliezer, English is my intellectual, it's how I talk and read and write, but I feel in Tamil, which I don't either read nor write or barely speak. But there are things, my father will be explaining something to me, and then he'll just switch to Tamil, say it really fast. I'm like, oh, okay, now let's go back to English and do it intellectually. But that, I find that I do that with my relationship to Jesus. And I want us to continue this conversation, but I'm going to add another layer. How is what you are ruminating on right now change the way you do your work as teachers and scholars? I'm all about having Asians as scholars because what we do is powerful. And I want you to sort of reflect, continue to reflect on what you're doing, what you've been speaking about, but add the piece about how is that embodied in the way you do your work?
So I'll start there because I'm very inspired by this talk about relationships. And I grew up, I'm old enough that I grew up in a time when, you know, pedagogy and also theological writing was all about, you know, getting the doctrines right. And especially, you know, in the Christian world, getting the doctrines right and teaching people what we believe, etc. The thing is, and interfaith work all started with, you know, how do we talk about what we believe? Trying to talk about what we believe makes interfaith dialogue really hard because it starts at the very hardest point. If we think of it as building relationships, and then we have, as you said, Damayanti, all the models of relationship. And as Amos was saying, our relationship with Jesus and for Christine, with other traditions we've been able to claim, gives us models of what relating means. But I also want to add to that the dimension of, and it's implicit in what everyone said, story. That it was really a big shift for me, given when I started my academic work and teaching to when I, mid-career started thinking about the impact of all of this on me. And I was blessed because I was dean for a while that I took a break in teaching for some years. And then when I came back, I was able to do the new things I've been thinking about, but never could find the way to fit them into what I was doing. So I needed the break. And it's more about starting with stories and relationships. How do we get to know people? We tell stories. Mm-hmm. And we realize as we get to know people and tell stories that all people are complex and multifaceted. I mean, if somebody is so simple that they can sum themselves up in one sentence, and they genuinely are that, we're pretty bored with that quickly. And I don't think anyone is. We all have complicated, multi-layered stories. And so for both in my teaching and I know this is huge for Christine, because I know about her pedagogy quite well, in my teaching, but also in my writing, I started moving more towards seeing how story could capture something and yet open up other interpretations of it, other ways for other people to relate to it, so that, I wasn't saying what was right. I was creating a relationship with the learners, with the audience, and with myself, where I was holding what I was discovering in a way that would allow it to evolve and continue, on its own life. So I didn't freeze it into this horrible, stony thing at one moment. So I think that's been a really important shift for me. And I know it's a shift that's been happening, but especially us Euro-American Christians need to realize that the question of what I believe for most religions in the world is not the most important question. It's what I do, what community am I committed to, what relationships do I have? And what I believe is in there, but it's only a little part of the mix.
I love this conversation, and I was furiously writing down things that I'm learning from Amos and Judith and everybody. And what's percolating for me is I had an aha moment when Amos and Judith were talking, and it was about my reaction to especially students in Asian diaspora in my classroom, who often cling to a Christian identity as their primary identity, and cannot articulate, right, like other frameworks of identity and matrices of identity that hold them together and up in their spiritual practice. And I'm realizing the more that I teach and live into plurality, that clinging to Christian identity is that reaction to the white gaze that's perpetually on their life. In having moved to different parts or even being born, right, in the United States, that we're often having to negotiate how we see ourselves through other people's eyes. And none of those eyes are correct, right? Yeah. Wait, I'm sorry, I can't hear you, Damayanti.
We can't hear you.
Oh, you can't hear me? Me? Oh, okay.
I can hear you, Christine.
I can hear you.
Oh, okay.
Hello, Zoom participants. If you could just hold for just a moment. We seem to have a disconnection between the Zoom bridge and the in-person.
Can you guys hear me speaking?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Give me just a moment here. Sorry, we lost you, and we're getting you back in the room here.
So here, Aaron's given the really.
Now we can hear you.
All right, go ahead. You can speak, Damayanti. You may.
Thanks.
You may
Thanks
speak
for
again now.
responding.
Okay, great. So yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say that that really makes me sad, right? When I encounter students, particularly students in Asian diaspora, who feel like they have to actually cling to what I think and I believe to be just a white evangelical purity theology up and cast that apart from their other identities, right? And that it is a response to erasure. Self-erasure sometimes is a response to larger frameworks of erasure that happen to people. And it's really painful to realize that. So one of the things that's changed in the way that I engage students in my teaching is with a lot more compassion. I used to feel a certain way, right, about Asian Americans not wanting to be ethnically identified or understand their own traditions and culture, or even Asian American people that only wanted to be identified as Asian American, because that's also a very colonial lens, where I'm going to be racialized and not, and that's it. Seen through a political lens, like that I use Asian American to identify myself in a very political way, because it's in alignment with particular political beliefs and movements. But I'm a Korean person, right? I'm a Korean person. And so this idea that there isn't an anchoring anywhere, and I'm going to cling to the identity of the Western gaze has kind of imposed upon me. And the only way that I can get away from that is clinging to a Christian identity, and holding those somehow together. I just realized that that's a very painful reconstruction of identity in response to multiple frameworks of erasure that happen not only from the white gaze, but internally in some communities, right, of Asian communities. So I can speak about this personally. When I go to Korea, I'm never Korean enough for people born in Korea. I will never be Korean. And I even encountered a student here where I teach who was visiting from Korea, and she came to my office for office hours, and she's like, what do you call yourself? And I said, oh, Korean. I'm a Korean person. She's like, are you though? That was her response, right? Are you though? It's that question of you can't be, because it's too, you can't be, because there are too many other touch points in your identity that are presenting for me. So when I go to Korea, when I'm in front of Korean people from Korea, I'm never Korean enough. When I'm here in the United States, I'm never generically Asian enough. Right? Like I'm never generically Asian enough. So multiple forms of erasure. And yeah, when that happens, you want to cling to a God that may just accept you for who you are, and being Christian is enough. It's a painful reaction. Right? So compassion, leading with compassion in my teaching as a realization of that in my own self has been a real turning point for me.
That's great. I feel
Okay, so starting with my own personal journey about this interfaith journey. We are familiar with the works of Paul Meter, and especially on types or models of religious identity and engagement. Basic one is exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism, and other books, more sophisticated ways of defining how we relate to people of other faiths. I used to think, although this was not mine, because I was not really into a deep religious faith when I started, never embraced the idea that there is only one way that leads to the mountain peak. And then I arrived at the understanding that there are many ways that lead to the same mountain peak. And then adopting a postmodern discourse that the mountain peak itself would collapse without the many paths. So the paths constitute the mountain peak. But I said, why should there be only one mountain peak? why should there not be many valleys and mountains there when you get there? So I think I have arrived at that point, but being a pastor in a church that is quite traditional, I have to really navigate well so that how can I express my understanding at the same time also help people understand and open their worlds in relation to other faiths. There was a time when I was so engrossed with the idea of all these models that when I had conversation with a person, I was always boxing the person, labeling the person. You are inclusivist. You are pluralist. You are adaption or a different kind of versions. And then I realized to myself, why am I doing this to that person? Why is it that I could not relate to the person as a person? Why is it that all my education about all these models have become a hindrance to my way of relating to the other person? I had that realization, and I'm glad that I did, which for me, what I value is not really much about the beliefs of that person, but the person himself or herself. And for me, that was a revelatory moment. And this kind of personal journey has informed not only my personal life, but also when I do administrative work. And it just happened this morning when I had to engage in conversation and present an idea with the Academic Affairs Committee of the Board of Trustees. And I am president of a seminary sponsored by the United Methodist and the United Church of Christ in the Philippines. And I don't have to say the details and expose the politics, but it's always a numbers game. If there's a numbers game, how many UCC professors, how many UMC professors, and for me, that's quite challenging, including staff. So I adapted our theme. Our theme is pluralism, a vision of decolonizing Christianity. And I presented an idea, a pluralism, a vision of decolonizing and decentering dualistic, pluralistic, denominational practices. And I said, this is a game changer because instead of just you and me, UMC and UCCP, when you have another group, then you are disoriented from that you and me categories and beyond the numbers game. So from the administrative point of view, I made a push this morning. I said, give me the freedom to hire another person for faculty that is beyond UMC and UCCP. And so another Christian group. And later on, I'm going to push for beyond Christianity. That's the effect of this one. So for me, it's very practical. And then, of course, the courses that I have taught has changed. I simply teach constructive theology, not realizing that I was using the Christian framework. And then later on, I taught theologies of religion that was purely theoretical. Then the last evolution of my course was basically about not just theologies of religion, but interfaith engagement and practices, leading to the more practical one and developing criteria on how to develop interfaith engaged congregations, becoming more practical. And then after that, I was challenged to teach global Christianities. And actually, it contributes to that by jarring, deconstructing, decentering Christianity, even within Christianity, when we teach global Christianities. My gosh. And then, the last 2 years of my teaching at United, I was asked to teach comparative ethics, religious ethics. Wow, that has been a challenge and really a decentering experience. And I believe that this is very much important to pursue in our highly globalized interfaith world. Thank you.
I want to open it up and I'm going to turn so we can see. But Judith, we lost the last bit of what you were saying before Christine came on. You remembered enough to reshare it now, or?
That's all right. It wasn't earth shaking.
Okay. I'm going to invite, and I'm going to make your life crazy by turning my chair a little bit. You watched the 5 of us speak. Add your voices to the conversation. And I mean more than just ask questions, but allow your stories, your ways of thinking to become part of the conversation with us. And if you're in the chat, Judith, I might ask you, if you can watch chat and if you see some questions in there, pull it up to us. If there are people in the room, I think there's a mic somewhere that can be passed around.
I will, because of what we're doing right now, I'll need you to repeat your question, please.
Okay. Is there anything in the, oh, Dory?
One of the things that has always amazed me is that some of the things that were connected with Christianity that was given over to other cultures just made no sense. Like when I was in Africa, the preachers all wore these heavy black robes, which made a lot of sense in Europe. But I can't imagine anybody being in Africa even for a week and still wearing the, teaching people that if you're a proper preacher or a proper choir person, you have to wear a robe. This is almost comical. And I also, years ago, spent time on an Indian reservation in Arizona. And this congregation, their very favorite hymn was "There'll be no dark clouds in heaven, the sun will be shining forever." And in a desert area where shade is the thing you see, and where people go out and dance when it's raining, how did anybody think to teach this song to these people in this setting? So many of the things that are culturally.
I'm going to tell it because if I'm going to amplify, I need to. So what I heard for the people on Zoom and for my colleagues was some of the European Christianity that was imposed in other cultures erased the natural ways of doing things. And the person who made the comment was saying, "This is really, I don't understand how that's helpful."
It never makes sense.
And it didn't make sense to me.
Damiante, Chris Chaves has his hand up.
Okay. You want to read this? Chris, can you talk? Either put it in chat or let us know how to.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, you can. Speak.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, wait, go ahead.
Okay, yes, thank you. Thank you for this forum. I'm really enjoying the conversation. I think one of the ways that we can engage in the process of true decolonialization is to engage in the what I believe is the reality that God is not a Christian.
Yeah.
Okay, boy, that's going to get me disinvited even from Eden Seminary. Okay. Secondly, we need to stop discussing Christian experience using only the Anglo-Saxon lenses. I'm sorry, St. Augustine and Luther, you two guys are just blips in the history of the human spiritual experience. And so it's that confidence that all of the quote unquote Christian world needs to have and express to not just, talk about, oh, there's Asian Christianity, there's Latino Christianity. Stop being a bully, No, put out your scholarship and the Asian spiritual experience that intersects with Confucius and Christianity and Buddhism. That is what is necessary. Respond with confidence about your experience because the world needs to hear it. The world no longer accepts Anglo-Saxon Christianity lenses. That's been discredited. So we need the rest of the world to, with confidence, express their own experiences because we all need it. Thank you for the opportunity.
I did notice that it was created, God may not, Jesus may not either. Amen. And that might be worth a conversation in itself. And Buckford, listen to me, President, Buckford Eden, we no longer only teach Anglo-Saxon Christianity here and leave that anymore. If our church historian makes a job of not doing that, we don't do that. Or we fight doing that. We have to do it because we get pushback, but we are intentional in not doing that anymore. And I'm kind of proud of this place for that. My one country.
I think we lost the sound from the chapel.
Okay, can you guys hear us online?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes? No, yes, okay.
Okay.
Will someone from online please just say something?
Judith, say
I
something.
I think it's back. I think it's back now.
Yeah, we can hear you.
No, we can't hear that.
Okay.
Okay. Amos.
Matt
Amos
is,
had it-
no, never mind, go back.
Yeah. Amos had his hand up, Damiante.
Oh, no, I couldn't hear her. That's
Oh,
why
that was it.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you guys hear us now?
Yes. Can I
Okay.
respond to that comment? So many things I want to say, but I'll just say this one thing, which is we really need to turn that paradigm around that minoritized people need to speak up more. Because we've always been speaking. We've always been speaking in more ways than using our words. And I think the paradigm, the onus is actually on, it's on white folks. The onus is on white folks. We have been speaking. And the thing is, how do we, as people that live in societies that are constructed around and founded on white supremacist understandings of Christianity and religion, hear people who have been speaking since the very beginning?
Yeah.
So it is not up to, there's a Bobby Sanchez, who's a Quechua rapper and poet, has this beautiful song called Land Back Please. And half of the song is in Quechua. And part of the song that is in English, he says, I don't owe you my translation. And I think there's something really powerful about that for those of us who've experienced minoritization. We don't owe anybody our translation. It is about listening more carefully beyond the words that you expect to hear. So that's all I wanted to say.
Does anyone else in the? Does anyone else?
I'll maybe add a couple comments along those lines. It actually circles back to a couple comments that were made earlier. Christine, when you said leading with compassion in the classroom, Damayanti, when you said, I feel in Tamil. And I think part of the challenge in this interreligious space or in this human space is that our discursivity, as we've been talking about, carries a lot of the communicative weight. And there's a sense in which, yes, obviously that's what communication is about, right? But we also know that communication is also about how we interact with each other at the level of affectivity. And oftentimes it's the lack of relational portals to actually learn how to feel with each other. But I would actually even say something more deeply. We don't know how to feel ourselves. My son has been teaching me a lot about compassion. For instance, starting with having compassion on myself, because I've buried all of my pains, right? And because I'm performing or I'm whatever, I'm co-opted by the system. And I don't even, I can't love my neighbor if I don't even understand myself. And so we lack, so coming back to the idea of, yeah, speaking up, if we're speaking up out of a lack of self-awareness, then our language is just going to be totalizing. And it is about this journey of maturation at a certain level, of becoming more human, which involves finding ourselves, not in the sense of the modern self, but the deeper parts of who we are. Having understanding of that, being able to learn how to name those parts of who we are that contemporary society, the market doesn't give us the ability to name, or only helps us name certain parts of it. And I do think that these spiritual dimensions of what we're talking about that are beneath these, what we've now called religious streams, do give us resources to name those parts of ourselves, to then feel those parts of ourselves more deeply and maybe for the first time, so that we can learn how to feel others, right? And then I think, Christine, as you were saying, then we can actually hear what the witness has been all along, because we've never been able to recognize what that witness is, because it's been reductive to certain discursive tropes or certain discursive categories or frames that don't give us the ability to name that affective pathic level that really, at the end of the day, probably drives us. We all neuroscience, drives us probably even more than our discourse. Our discourse is ways in which some of that drive has been given ability by dominant culture to be magnified, right? So even our language is the conventions that, if you will, dominant culture allows for articulation, whereas that compassionate self underneath is yearning for even that recognition, the ability to witness and attend to that witness. So there's that deeper level there of just give me some more text. It's how do we even, because we can read the text, but if we can't feel the message underneath, it's like scripture, right? If we just read scripture for information, we're only going to get information. But are we attending to the prophets and their pathos?
Yeah.
And that's the ability then to read underneath, and that comes from then having learned who we are as pathic creatures as well, and giving permission to recognize and have compassion upon ourselves and one another. So I really wanted to kind of say amen along those lines.
Hi, sorry, we cannot hear you over inside the chapel. Please just hold just a moment.
No. Go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me guys? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Fabulous. And I want to go back into, but I'm noticing how much I'm feeling my way through this conversation as much as thinking my way through it. And the language that is, when you've been being asked to speak louder, when you've been yelling at the top of your lungs, I've done for 40 years. If you can't hear, I got no more. But also, you will speak in ways that which are understand. I don't need to translate anymore to be obvious to you. I can feel the range of that, and I'm also a teacher that has to still be able to communicate in ways that my students can hear, and while they're still telling me, I was listening to Christine and Amos talk about, salvation. No, I'm Asian American, and I choose, or I'm not an Asian American because I don't, let me be vulgar, have slimy enough eyes to be an Asian. I have actually been asked, how do you manage to call yourself an Asian? Like, come from that continent. But I don't translate and I don't have the accent right. And then to be asked, so make yourself available to us, just feels violating after. It just feels violating. And I don't want to get into oppression and victimization, but it is a frustrating space to try and do this work. And what we're all saying is, stop trying to get it right in your head. Start getting it right in your heart and in relationship. And then the knowledge will start to make sense or not. Because that's where the work is. I don't like having conversations with a Jew and a Muslim and a Hindu and a Buddhist, because I'm learning nothing. But when I speak to a person whose sacred vision is something I want to grasp, and they're interested in grasping mine, then interfaith conversations happen. It was talked about, we call things, I fought so hard to say, stop saying interreligious. None of us belong to religions. Christians may belong to religion because we were told so. But we truly don't. We belong to faiths, and our faiths don't fit into religions. I always, Wendy Donegan, my teacher, said, there's no such thing as Hinduism. They're all the religions of the Indus, and people came and said, oh, these are the Indus religions, so let's call it Hinduism. That's the gaze. So then we decided we were going to have a proper Hinduism. That didn't work. It still doesn't work. And that passion for how to do this work is so important and necessary to get it done well. I'm going to open back into Zoom space, and I know we're driving Katie crazy, and into this room. Are there pieces that people would like to add? Walk up here and talk into my mic, please. That might be the easiest way to do this. Oh,
this one?
Okay. Yep. Location.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
They won't stop.
Okay, that's okay. I don't need to be seen. So, and I wrote my question down so I wouldn't rattle too long. So how do we hold space for pluralism within our own faith community when often that community has some pretty hard and set fundamentals? They may allow and tolerate for other beliefs outside their denomination, but I have found that there is an ironclad resistance to the allowance of such pluralism, with the overarching concern of diluting the waters of the pillars of faith, because people will defend that to the grave, and the more progressive pluralistic types tend to be so much more the minority, to be relegated to the back, or worse, silenced and being unlistened to. So what realistically can pluralism hold in denominations without just resorting to starting up yet another religion?
Thank you. Did you guys get the gist of this conversation? I'm just going to say this: the church is dying, thanks be to God, so we won't have to worry about it. My flippant answer to that is, that's not working, it's dying. Good luck with that. But I think there are more sophisticated answers over there. Any of you? Amos is like, I'm not trying to hear it. Judith, do you have something to say?
Well, yeah, it's a big problem. And that I think, as with many of the issues that polarize our society, a lot of the resistance is from fear. And fear that somehow Christianity is challenged or on the decline. And it is, sociologically speaking, we see this. It says in the Bible, perfect love casts out fear. That's easy to say and hard to achieve. But I think if we go back to Christine's compassion, we have to realize where the fear is coming from before we can speak to it. Now, I'm not saying that makes it easy, but it at least brings us into the right mindset of trying to figure out how to open people up. All of us on this panel, and I think, many, many people who have been involved, who have multiple interfaith identities, personalities, for whatever reason, have learned that it strengthens their Christianity. It strengthens themselves. But it's hard to convince somebody who hasn't experienced that is the truth, right? It really is difficult. And yet it's something that I think we have to bring love and compassion to that understanding and pray.
Amos, you put something in the chat. Do you want to speak it into the room?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was just reiterating the point I think that is underneath our discussion, which is that fear is an emotion. And we oftentimes don't know where our emotions come from. And so that and I'm not sure, Christine, how much license you want to give me, but leading with compassion, I would say would be, in my mind, helpful from the perspective of giving students space to begin to excavate their emotions as part of their own learning, right? So that even at this level of graduate level education, I mean, the ability to go deeper, to be able to name the fears that are underneath our culture and therefore in our lives, that itself, I think, is a really, in part, what this kind of work that we do could open up to. And giving students space not just to name those fears, but to actually have compassion upon themselves, have compassion upon them. For instance, I shared about my parents and the way in which I was raised. One part of me at one point was a little bit upset. Well, why didn't you teach me Chinese when I was growing up, right? But my son taught me, because he's having compassion upon me, and by the way, he's got a PhD too, so it's kind of fun to kind of learn a lot from him. But he said, you have compassion upon yourself, Dad, because otherwise you keep, responding to these emotions that are driving you that you don't know about. And then that helped me to then say, okay, beyond being upset at my parents, how about me recognizing their own traumas and their own life stories and their own journeys? And, the fear, Judith, that you're talking about the other. Yeah, if we aren't able to name those fears in our own lives, in our communities, then we'll never be able to name the fears of all these other things that are in society that otherwise then we just weaponize, right, in our political discourse to keep those fears that then drive us to then make certain what we feel are rational decisions, but they're not. So.
I think the issue of fear can be applied to other aspects of our economic and political life. I think there is this tendency among us, especially in my case before, when I thought that history would just unfold and progress in a linear fashion, especially adapting the Enlightenment model, that once we have informed people and educated people, that we progress and we become more open and open because we are more informed and become educated. And that's, for me, is not actually true. It's not accurate. We have these studies that say that, for example, if you teach by saying that there is socioeconomic disparity in the US, in which the CEO has 200% more income than the average worker, normally we think that this person will follow our way of thinking and say, yes, it's true. But actually, when we talk about this disparity, the other person would say, are you a socialist or are you a communist, right? So I also edited a book, and the title is Teaching in a World of Violent Extremism. And actually, my introduction to that book is that one of the reasons why I'm able, at least in my mature years, to engage in conversation with people who disagree with me passionately is that I start with the question about what is it really that you're afraid of? What is it really that you're afraid of losing? Because everyone, so I can go to the more conservative Iowa or to Nebraska and others and engage, especially people in the rural areas and folks, because oftentimes we vote against our own interest out of fear, out of security, securing something for us. And so I think for me, one of the best approaches, if not the best approach to dealing with people of other faiths, and especially ways of dismantling violent extremism, which was the title of the book, is to deal with the question about security and fear, because we all have that. And I know by practical experience that it's not really debate that would change the person. We like to think about debate as changing the person. Many times, in fact, it hardens the other person because the person does not want to listen. The person is always thinking about how to respond to defend his position or her. So for me, even in issues related to gender, sexuality, and others, when you establish friendship, the other person, especially when it is your own child, your own daughter, your own son, telling you that, Dad, I have this different sexual ways of being. And it's really hard for us to be against a person we care so much. In fact, we are more open. So for me, the key to building relationship is building the trust. And then the person is much more open. So for me, two approaches: building trust and friendship, and then addressing the issue of fear and security. In that sense, we can engage with people of different types, ideologies, religions, and others.
Other questions or comments to be put into the room? Or if there's anything in the chat that doesn't do with Dr. Jeff?
In a context,
You have to be louder, get closer, sorry.
So recognizing that it's inappropriate to dictate one another's language in pluralistic relationship, how would we describe the respect with which we enter into those relationships and speak about one another in the ways that people want to be described and spoken to?
To answer me the question, how, if we're in a space where we are learning, dictating how people want to be understood is not helpful, how do we go about doing that work?
Can you say it again?
If we've come to realize that giving others the words by which to describe themselves or talk about themselves in the end is unhelpful, what is a better way to go about it? Is that fair-ish?
Just dictating people's language is unhelpful. And how can we be in respectful relationship with one another?
If dictating people's language is not helpful, how do we be in respectful relationship with them?
I think my go-to, especially in teaching, when I'm in a classroom and I'm the only teacher and I'm Christian and I'm teaching about interreligiosity, for instance, I will do my best to never speak for somebody whose experience is not mine or experience that I'm not anchored in. So widening our circle of relationships to include people around us who are experts in their own experience. And also to when they're in our space and we're sharing space with them and we're amplifying their voices instead of our interpretation of their voices, to also not put the onus on them to represent everybody that they look like, right? Or everybody that they believe with or are in community with. I think creating space instead of being, creating space for other people to come be alongside of you and for us to be alongside of them, and to think about ourselves in a larger realm of teachers and educators that are not just filtered through our gaze or our voices, but are amplified. And I think that I have found is the most helpful practice, but it's really hard in classrooms and in Western education, because we're taught when we go through the system of learning how to teach that we have to be the experts and we have to be masters of this information, and that we're expected to be the ones that filter it to our students. And I find that when I let go of that and instead amplify what's already in the room with the voices of my students, for instance, and the ancestors that they bring and the communities that they bring, and then also invite colleagues to take up space where only I have been taking up space, that it becomes a much more fruitful place and a more equitable place, which is what we really want, right? So that's been my personal practice. And it has been about just letting go of those constructs that we've internalized as educators, which is we have to master this material.
Right. Let me say too that in the classroom or in the parish, whenever you're with a group, you've got to, somebody, and if you're the teacher, it's you probably, can be in conversation, has to identify a general goal for the course or the meeting or the series or whatever, a common goal that everyone kind of buys into. Once you do that, you can step out of the way and let people speak to that goal from their own experience and in the ways that they want to. So we're terrified as teachers, or at least I was at first, that if we aren't the one that's the expert, things will get out of hand. But if there's a goal that creates a community right there, and it allows the people within the community to bring their own voices and their own needs and their own opinions to shape how the group moves towards that goal. And it's can be hard work, but I think it's much better than making yourself the expert. You learn a ton.
This is my community that I teach with. And the part of not being an expert is let your books speak. And if I never teach books, I teach people that I admire and I want people's voices to be heard. And my students know that you've actually met most of these people in my classroom through the pages of their words. And that's the space that allows more voices to be heard. The simple idea, I'm not going to teach you, I'm going to have my friends come in. I do in class what I'm doing right here. I let my friends speak. I have very close friends. I have very, very close friends. I'm very proud of my circle of friends. And here are 4 representations of that. And I think that is how you allow others to speak. Is first, I don't teach knowledge. Introduce people to people. Introduce people to people. Whether it be of your faith, of other faiths, different points of view. I don't teach a book, I teach people. And I have been lucky that I've met many, if not most of the people whose books I share with my students. I just want, here's a cool person, and here's a cool person, and here's a cool person. And they're like, I hate this person. I'm like, what do you hate this person? What you hear that makes you hate this person? That changes the whole game. And makes you wider. I'm looking at time.
And I want to, what I'm going to do is this. Amos, Eleazar, Christine, Judith, is there anything you'd like to add to the conversation that's happening before I turn this back to Mary Balfour to put them into work? I know it's wrong, sorry. You're welcome, Amos. I'm so glad you came. I'm gonna hand this over. I'm gonna hand this over to Mary, but before I do, I want to thank my friends who have taken time, 2 of them getting up at 6 o'clock to be here at 6 o'clock in the morning. So you know one of the global things, if you center it in St. Louis, you're asking people to get up at 6 in the morning or stay awake till 10, 11 at night. Just saying. For us to do what we can do in the center of the universe. Just saying. But thank you.
Fabulous. And it continues. So as we continue to tell stories, as we continue to meet each other in relationship, we're going to have a chance for about a 10-minute break here. So there's food in the back, there's restrooms in the building, of course. On Zoom, we're going to assign you randomly to some breakout rooms so that you will be with one of our alumni small group facilitators. And so we have Ben, and we have Brad, and we have Marianne. And they're going to bring their expertise into that facilitation of those rooms. In the building here, we're going to count off by 3s for you all to go into rooms. The rooms are all going to be to the right as we exit the chapel here. And so I'm going to point to you. You're going to say 1, 2, or 3. If you're 1, you're going to go downstairs to room 100. There's an elevator. You need to go in the center of the building and down to 100. If you are 2, you're going to go to room 200, and if you are 3, you're going to room 201. So 1, 2, 3.